The airport was alive with bright daylight, rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and endless announcements when everything changed in a single heartbeat. One moment, Rowan Mercer was standing near Gate 18, holding a cup of coffee and waiting for a delayed flight after attending a construction conference. The next moment, a frightened woman rushed toward him with tears in her eyes, gripped his arms so tightly that the coffee nearly slipped from his hand, and whispered words that made no sense at all. She begged him to pretend to be her husband for just 40 minutes because if he didn't, she believed her entire life would fall apart before she ever boarded another plane. If you believe kindness and second chances can completely change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this story with someone who believes in hope, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness 2 for more emotional stories that stay with you long after they end. Rowan had always believed that ordinary people lived ordinary lives. At 38, he worked long hours restoring old community buildings across small towns, rarely took vacations, and preferred quiet mornings over crowded places. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier after a long illness, leaving behind memories that still visited him during silent evenings. Since then, he had learned to keep his head down, avoid unnecessary attention, and move through life without expecting surprises. Airports were simply places where strangers crossed paths for a few moments before disappearing forever. The young woman standing beside him looked no older than 29. Her name, as Rowan would soon discover, was Tessa Vale. She wore a simple blue dress beneath a light gray jacket, carried a single backpack, and looked as though she had not slept in days. Her eyes kept searching the terminal behind them with quiet panic, and although she tried to appear calm, her trembling hands revealed the fear she could no longer hide. Before Rowan could ask any questions, Tessa gently slipped her hand around his arm and leaned against his shoulder like someone greeting a loved one after a long journey. Anyone watching would have believed they were a married couple reunited after weeks apart. Rowan's heartbeat accelerated as he noticed two sharply dressed men walking slowly through the terminal, scanning every face they passed. Tessa's grip tightened. She quietly explained that they were looking for her and that she only needed 40 minutes before her connecting flight departed. After that, she promised, Rowan would never have to see her again. Every sensible thought told him to walk away and call airport security. Yet something in her exhausted eyes reminded him of his late wife during her hardest days, when she had silently begged the world not to give up on her. Compassion defeated caution. Rowan nodded once, and together they began walking through the bright terminal as though they had shared years of marriage instead of less than a minute of conversation. The airport cafe became their temporary shelter. Sunlight streamed through massive windows overlooking rows of parked airplanes while families laughed nearby and children pointed excitedly toward departing flights. Everything outside their table looked perfectly peaceful, making Tessa's fear seem almost invisible to everyone except Rowan. Slowly, pieces of her story emerged. Months earlier, Tessa had uncovered financial crimes inside the investment company where she worked as an accountant. Millions of dollars intended for charitable housing projects had quietly disappeared into hidden accounts controlled by powerful executives. When she refused to destroy evidence, she became the target instead. Legal investigations had finally begun, but someone wanted to recover the documents she carried before she could testify. The files were safely encrypted inside a flash drive hidden within the lining of her backpack. She believed the men following her wanted that evidence at any cost. Rowan listened carefully without interrupting. He had spent years rebuilding schools, shelters, and libraries for struggling communities. The thought that money meant to help families had been stolen filled him with quiet anger. He realized that the frightened stranger beside him wasn't running from responsibility. She was running because she had chosen honesty over comfort. The next half hour felt like hours. The two men appeared outside the cafe more than once, pretending to check departure screens while watching every entrance. Rowan remained calm, occasionally smiling at Tessa as though discussing weekend plans instead of survival. He remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about courage. Real courage, he often said, wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it simply meant standing beside someone who had nobody else. When they finally left the cafe, Rowan suggested they stroll through the public art gallery located inside the terminal. Bright daylight poured across polished floors, reflecting colorful sculptures and paintings that travelers barely noticed as they hurried toward their gates. Surrounded by tourists taking photographs, they blended naturally into the crowd. For several peaceful minutes, Tessa smiled for the first time all day. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone beginning to believe that maybe the world still contained good people. As they walked, Rowan spoke about his own life for the first time in years. He shared how losing his wife had left him emotionally empty, how work had become his escape, and how he had convinced himself that opening his heart again would only invite more pain. Tessa quietly admitted that she had spent most of her adult life believing independence meant never asking anyone for help. That belief had nearly destroyed her. They were strangers, yet somehow each understood the loneliness carried by the other. Soon the 40 minutes were almost over. An announcement echoed across the terminal calling passengers for Tessa's flight. Relief briefly appeared on her face before disappearing again. One of the men had returned and was standing only a short distance away, speaking urgently into his phone while watching them. Rowan made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of heading directly toward the gate, he calmly approached two uniformed airport officers while remaining beside Tessa. He explained that they believed they were being followed and quietly asked for assistance. Tessa then revealed the investigation, the evidence she carried, and the names connected to the case. Within minutes, additional officers arrived. The suspicious men attempted to leave but were stopped before reaching the exit. After brief questioning, investigators discovered false identification documents and communication records linking them to the financial crimes already under investigation. The danger that had followed Tessa for weeks ended beneath the bright afternoon sun filtering through the airport's enormous glass ceiling. She stood silently, overwhelmed by relief she could hardly believe. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from fear anymore but from gratitude. She thanked Rowan for risking his own comfort to help someone he had never met. Rowan simply smiled and admitted that perhaps they had both saved each other in different ways. Before boarding, Tessa handed him a folded note instead of asking for his phone number. She explained that if life ever wanted their paths to cross again, it would find a way. Then she disappeared down the jet bridge, carrying not only evidence that would expose corruption but also renewed faith that kindness still existed among strangers. Weeks turned into months. Life returned to normal, or at least Rowan believed it had. He went back to restoring old buildings, organizing volunteer projects, and spending quiet evenings alone. Yet something had changed inside him. He smiled more often. He accepted invitations he once would have declined. He realized that grief had slowly built invisible walls around his heart, and one unexpected afternoon at an airport had begun tearing them down. One crisp autumn morning, Rowan received a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was the same folded note he had watched Tessa carry months earlier. Attached to it was a newspaper clipping announcing that several executives had been convicted after investigators recovered overwhelming evidence. Thousands of families would finally receive funding for affordable housing projects that had nearly been lost forever. Beneath the article, Tessa had written only a few heartfelt sentences. She thanked Rowan for proving that courage often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. She explained that the 40 minutes he had given her had protected not only her future but the futures of countless families she would never meet. She ended by saying that every home those projects would someday build carried a small piece of his kindness inside its walls. Rowan folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the photograph of his late wife. Instead of feeling guilt for moving forward, he felt peace. Loving someone who was gone did not mean refusing to care about those still living. His wife had always believed kindness multiplied itself in ways people could never predict. Now he finally understood what she had meant. The following spring, Rowan attended the opening ceremony for one of the newly completed housing communities. Children laughed while riding bicycles beneath bright blue skies. Parents planted flowers outside homes they had once believed they would never own. Volunteers painted playground fences while neighbors greeted one another with hopeful smiles. Standing near the entrance was Tessa. Neither had expected the reunion. They simply smiled, walked toward each other, and embraced like old friends whose lives had once crossed at exactly the right moment. There were no dramatic speeches, no promises, and no impossible fairy tale ending. There was only quiet gratitude between two people whose brief encounter had forever changed the direction of both their lives. They spent the afternoon helping families unpack furniture, serving meals, and watching children race across freshly cut green grass under the warm daylight. Every joyful laugh reminded Rowan that the greatest moments in life rarely begin with careful plans. Sometimes they begin with a frightened stranger asking for help. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a comment sharing a moment when kindness changed your life, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness too, so together we can continue spreading stories that remind the world compassion still matters. Special request, comment below with, "Kindness always finds a way, red heart," if you believe one small act of courage can change countless lives. As the sun slowly settled toward the horizon, casting soft afternoon light across the neighborhood, Rowan looked around at families laughing outside homes that almost never existed. He realized that destiny had not asked him to become a hero. It had only asked him not to walk away when a frightened stranger reached for his arm. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't begin with extraordinary strength. They begin with 40 minutes of kindness, one brave decision, and the willingness to stand beside someone who has nowhere else to turn. And in a world that often feels divided by fear, perhaps that simple choice remains the most powerful story of all.